Hi, Jane. Welcome.
Hi,
Uh, I am delighted to have you as my guest today.
delighted to be here. Thank you.
Thank you for your time. I would like to ask you a couple of questions around disability. But let me first introduce you. Jane Hatton, you are a disabled social entrepreneur, TEDx speaker, and author, but you're also the CEO and founder of Evenbreak, which is the award-winning social enterprise. And the purpose of your organization, please correct me if I am wrong, is to bring organizations who want to recruit disabled people and help disabled people get good jobs.
Yes,
And
exactly that.
Evenbreak is run by and for disabled people. So, Jane, can we start with the definition of disability? What is disability?
Yes, I mean, that's a really interesting question, and I'm really glad you asked it because often people look at disability and assume it's people in wheelchairs. And people look at disability and think it's a tragedy, poor disabled people, it's such a shame. And actually, certainly in the UK and in other countries around the world, we look at the social model of disability. And the social model doesn't talk about the tragic individual person. It talks about the barriers that disabled people face. So, for example, someone who does use a wheelchair isn't disabled by the wheelchair, they're disabled by stairs and narrow doorways. If everywhere had flat access or lifts, then people who use wheelchairs wouldn't be disabled because they'd be able to get to the same places as everybody else. So for me, disability is a condition which means that you have to face barriers in society that other people don't have to face. So that could be the built environment, it could be the way we communicate with people, it could be recruitment processes. So disability is about a difference which isn't accommodated in our normal society, whether that's attitudes or anything else. So it could be mental health condition, it could be autism, it could be hearing or sight loss, it could be learning difficulties, it could be anything. It's so broad and diverse. And actually, about a fifth of us are disabled, and most of us know somebody who is, close to someone who's disabled. So it's much more broad, I think, than most people tend to think of it. We look at the Paralympics and we think, oh, it's people who've got a limb missing, or, and that's very narrow, that those are disabled people, of course, but it's a very narrow representation, and disability is much more broad and covers, different styles of thinking, as well as physical differences, cognitive differences. So yes, it's a fascinating subject.
It could be visible and invisible.
Absolutely. And usually is invisible. Most disabled people don't look disabled, whatever looking disabled looks like. But if you have autism or diabetes or dyslexia or a mental health condition, you don't walk around with a tattoo on your forehead that says disabled. So most disabled people don't look disabled, but can be just as disabled from the social model perspective as someone who is obviously visibly disabled.
Jane, you are someone who has been living with disability for years, for 16 years.
Yeah.
Why are so many people frightened of disability?
I think there's a lot of reasons, and it's interesting when we talk to organizations about diversity, disability always seems to be the poor relation, the last thing they talk about. And I do think it's because, in common with all of the other differences, the other diversity strands or characteristics, disability is very much about perception. So people think that disabled people are somehow less than non-disabled people. And that's the same when you talk about race or gender or, any of the other characteristics. But additionally, with disability, there are the structural barriers that we face. So it's not just about how people think about us, it's also about the website might not be accessible, the building might not be accessible, the transport might not be accessible. So it's those kind of structural barriers as well. And I think that sometimes the perception from employers is that it's going to be really expensive, that we're going to have to knock down the building and rebuild it, or we're going to have to rewrite every policy. So I think it's that kind of fear of the structural differences, but on a more human level, I
Mhm.
think of all the characteristics, disability is the one that can happen to anybody at any time. So we're unlikely to wake up in the morning and be a different race to the one we went to bed last night. We're unlikely to be a different gender. But we could have a stroke or a heart attack or be run over by a bus or develop MS or whatever that
True.
kind of thing. There's no, you know, disability doesn't discriminate. You can become disabled however rich or poor you are, whatever skin color you have.
So true.
And I think that at a human level, there's, because we portray disability as a tragedy, which it isn't, um, we're frightened of becoming disabled. You know, people will say when someone has a baby, oh, I don't care what gender it is, but is it healthy? As though the worst thing that could be that the child has a
Mm,
disability. And I think that's really sad. And I can see why people look at it as a tragedy, because it's often how it's portrayed, you know, on the media, in documentaries and in films. Oh, poor disabled person. And actually, you know, the disabled people that I know aren't objects of pity at all. They're feisty, independent, opinionated, skilled, talented, just as diverse as anybody else is. And you know, being disabled, you can live just as fulfilling a life as somebody who is not disabled. And I think that's really an important message, that no, nobody thinks, oh, I hope I'm disabled someday. But we should know that if that happens, it's not the end of the world. We have, if I can just tell a little story, we have one of our most recent recruits. We only employ disabled people at Evenbreak, because why wouldn't we?
mhm,
And one of our most recent recruits is Mohammed, who is blind. He became fully blind in his teens. And he will say now that things have happened in his life that would never have happened if he'd remained sighted. So he's climbed Kilimanjaro, you know, he's done all sorts of, he's played blind cricket for the UK. He's done all sorts of things he would never have done if he'd remained sighted. But he's also married and a father and all of those other things that the rest of us do. And you know, he says, well, thank goodness I lost my sight, because look at all the opportunities it gave me. And that's an unusual reaction, I think. But I think it's important to get that message across, that becoming disabled means your life will be different. It doesn't necessarily mean it will be worse. And so it isn't something we should be frightened of. It certainly isn't something should be frightened of talking about,
mm,
because it's such an amazing subject and people are so diverse. There's so much to learn from it, that, you know, it shouldn't ever be the elephant in the room that we don't discuss. It should be discussed in the same way we talk about what was on television last night, or what the weather's going to do this afternoon, or whatever it might be.
mhm, mhm. And what is, I would like to come to the disability in the workplace, because I know that your particular interest is about the disability in the
Yeah.
workplace, and you wrote 2 books, if I am not wrong, in that regard, and it's about the inclusive recruitment. What's the situation in the organization? What is preventing us from including people with disabilities in the workforce?
I think within recruitment, we've kind of always done what we've always done. We've always used the same methods, the same processes, and we can see the result that that's got us. You know, if we talk about disability, particularly in the UK, there's a 30% gap in between, you know, the proportion of disabled people who are in work compared to the proportion of non-disabled people who are in work. So you're twice as likely to be unemployed if you're disabled in the UK. And actually, that's pretty good compared to a lot of other countries, which is quite shocking when
Mhm,
you think about it. But some of the barriers are that the recruitment process, which has given us this fairly undiverse workforce, hasn't changed. And if we don't change what we're doing, we're not going to get different results. That's kind of common sense. So I think that some of the barriers that disabled people, but also other minorities, so whether it's skin color or sexual orientation or gender identity, we all have to face the same kind of recruitment processes and the barriers that are within those. And my strong belief is that those barriers aren't there on purpose. Nobody has designed it to exclude certain groups of people. But because they were designed by people who don't have those differences, they have those biases kind of unconsciously built in. So, for example, many disabled candidates who are looking for work are very reluctant to apply for jobs unless they know that that particular employer is really disability friendly, is really interested in their talent,
Mhm.
and won't be put off by whatever their condition might be. And most companies will assume that we would know that because they know that. They know that internally they wouldn't discriminate. But actually, if a candidate doesn't know that, they're
Mhm.
not going to apply for the job. So it's discriminatory by default almost. So one of the things that organizations really need to do is be very explicit about how inclusive they are, how they welcome talent, whatever size, shape, or color it comes in. And also look at the way they attract candidates, but also the way they assess candidates. Because again, the recruitment process, as long as recruitment has been a thing, has revolved around CVs and interviews. It's, you know, age old, it's been there for decades. People don't question it because it's what we've always done. But if we look a bit more deeply at those things, they do have bias built into them. So for example, if I think about CVs,
Mhm.
you could have two CVs from two completely different people that look different, and a recruiter will make assumptions about which one is going to be the best candidate.
Mhm.
And they're basing that decision on historical information, which is obviously what a CV is, rather than future potential. So we rely on a candidate having had work experience that allows them to demonstrate the abilities that they have and the skills and the talents that they have. And in an ideal world, that would be fine. But in the real world, different candidates have had different opportunities for those work experience. So someone who has whistled through public school, gone to a red brick university, got a first from Oxford or Cambridge, is more likely to get to interview than someone who was raised in an inner city, went to a state comprehensive, went to what would be seen as a lower university, will not look as good on their CV. And yet that person might have had to work much, much harder to have achieved what they've achieved. So the CV really shows us the privilege that someone's had, not their potential. And similarly, interviews tend to demonstrate which candidates are best at blagging at interviews. And some people are extrovert, you know, regardless of disability. Some people are extrovert, are very good at selling themselves, very good at, you know, showing the best side of themselves. Other people, not so much. They might be introverted. They might be autistic. They might have social anxiety. They might have a speech impairment. Their hearing might be impaired, and they might not shine in interview in the same way that somebody else would. But all they're being judged on is their ability to be interviewed rather than their ability to do the job
Mhm.
in hand. And I think every recruiter that's listening to this now
Yeah.
will know that they have interviewed amazing candidates that were brilliant. CV was fantastic. They breezed through the interview, clearly the best person for the job. And then they take them on and they think, oh, this isn't what we were expecting. And actually, I wonder if we base our hiring decisions on the wrong things. And, you know, there are lots of things that we can do either instead of, or if we're not that brave, as well as using CVs and interviews to assess candidates' ability to do the job that, because obviously at the end of the day, recruitment is about finding the best person for the job. And I'm not convinced that what we do currently always helps us find the best person for the job.
Mhm. And you know, what, Jane, I am. How can we do that? Okay, how can we remove that fear, these barriers? And because my understanding from you is we need to first change the mindset
Yeah.
around disability. So what needs to be done? Or would you be willing to share maybe some practical examples that you have observed in some organizations? I don't know what.
Yeah.
Yeah.
No, I think you're right. The mindset is the most important thing. I think once we have the mindset right, the rest of it will almost follow automatically. And I think the mindset needs to very much change from, oh, poor disabled people, we ought to give them a chance, which is often what I hear, to, oh my goodness, there's so much talent out there we're missing out on. And once we can see that some of the things that we do might prevent the talent that we need from coming to us, then we are motivated to remove those barriers, because why wouldn't we want that talent? So I think the whole narrative around disability needs to change from one about charity and pity to one about talent. And my view, yes, I'm biased because I'm disabled, but actually I did have this view before I became disabled, is that going back to the social model of disability that I mentioned right at the beginning, by default, every disabled person, whatever their condition might be, faces barriers that other people don't. And so in order to just live our everyday lives, we have to find different ways of doing things. So it might be different ways of working, different ways of traveling, different ways of communicating, different ways of solving problems. And what that means is that we develop skills in innovation, in creativity, in project management. You know, someone who has to travel to a venue who isn't disabled will just either hop in the car or on the train and go, and that's it, outside COVID, obviously. For someone who's disabled, they might have to look at, is the transport accessible? Or if I'm driving, is there accessible parking when I get there? If so, can I get into the building? Is that accessible? Will the people, when I get there, offer me the support I need? So it has to be planned, almost like a military exercise. It gives you those project management skills that most employees need anyway. So for me, the mindset of the recruiter should be, it would be great if we got some disabled candidates, because not only will they bring the same diversity of skills that everybody else has, but also they will have this additional creative thinking, problem solving, resilience, determination, that maybe some of the other candidates might not have. So once we start thinking about disabled candidates as premium candidates, not as charity candidates, then everything else falls in place. And I think then from a practical point of view, it's not that difficult. So you make it really explicit in your advertising that you welcome talent, and that if there are barriers, you will do whatever it takes to remove those barriers. You make it very explicit that you're advertising in places where people will see that you're serious about this. It's not just a strap line at the bottom that says we're an equal opportunities employer. Anybody can say that. Most people don't believe it because their experience will show otherwise. But if you've proactively advertised your role in, I'm going to say, a specialist job board like Evenbreak, but you know, a specialist job board, or media that is, you know, targeted at particular groups of people, that's a very powerful demonstration that you mean this. You're not just saying it, it's something you actually live as an organization. And then in terms of things like making the recruitment process barrier free, it's about looking at other ways to assess candidates. So that might be, for example, instead of a CV, or maybe as well as a CV, if it's too scary to band them all together, you know, decide for a role, what are the really important qualities that a candidate would need to have to do that role really well? And it will be different for every role. So it might be, for this role, someone needs to be really good at detail, or they might need to be really good at interpersonal communication, or they might need to be really creative. So decide what qualities that role needs, and then ask questions about those qualities, so that all you're doing when you're shortlisting is basing your decision on who is the right person for the job, not what job history they've got, not what university they went to, not what address they have, not how old they are, because none of those things are relevant to whether they can do the job or not. So you're just literally shortlisting on, do they have the abilities we need for this particular role? And then with interviews, unless the job involves being interviewed on a regular basis, then interviews are really only showing you how good somebody is at being interviewed. So maybe instead give them a work-based task that they would need to do within that job, and they can show you instead of tell you how good they are. So we have a candidate who would say, you know, he wants a job in coding. Are you better asking him in an interview how good he is at coding, or giving him some coding to do and he'll show you? And obviously the latter is the better, because then you're actually testing how good he is, not just how good he is at talking about it. And actually that can be translated to pretty much any job. So for example, we recently appointed a social media manager. So instead of saying, send us your CV and we'll interview you, we said, here's a video that we produced. How would you show that on social media? Which channels would you use? What would you say about it? How would you measure the impact? Because that's what we're going to want her to do, or him. In this case, it was her in the job. And what we want to do is test their ability to do that, not their ability to talk about doing that. And you know, and a similar thing, we've got an exciting brand new service where we have careers coaches. So it was asking, you know, if you have a candidate that comes to you with this disability, facing these barriers, what kind of advice would you give them? Because that's far more relevant than show me which university you went to. We need to know they've got
Absolutely.
qualifications, but after that, the rest of it becomes.
Absolutely.
So for me, it's about organizations being brave. And actually, it isn't that brave, because what it means is they're going to make much better hires than they ever have done, because they're purely testing people on their ability to do the job in hand,
Mhm.
rather than, you know, how privileged they've been in the past or how good they are at blagging at interviews.
Absolutely. Jane, our time is up, already up, but I would like to ask you one more question, and then I'm finishing. Recruitment is the fundamental step. That's my
Yeah.
understanding in terms of including disabled people. But what once we include this or when we recruit disabled people, okay, in our organization, it doesn't necessarily mean that they will be
Mhm.
automatically included.
Absolutely.
What else needs to be done to make these people feel they are included?
Yeah, so I think that's important. And actually, that needs to be right, because you could recruit all the right people and then they could leave if they don't feel valued. So I think it's very much about a number of things, none of which are difficult. One of which is to say to every new candidate, a new recruit that you employ, whether they're disabled or not, what do we need to do to help you shine in this role?
Mm.
So it's about adjustments. For some people, that might be flexible working. It might be, can I work from home a couple of days a week? It might be, oh, I need a bigger monitor because my eyesight isn't good. It might be, it could be, you know, can you give me instructions that are written down so I can refer to them? You know, they're usually very simple things that can be sorted out. But if we don't ask that question and people are having to battle on without those adjustments, they're not going to feel valued. They're not going to be able to contribute in the way they should. And I feel that very strongly that's for every new recruit, not just for disabled recruits. But also, I think it's about having a culture where, as we said right at the beginning, disability is an everyday topic of conversation. It isn't something that people have to hide, pretend that they're, you know, try and mask. A lot of people talk about masking, you know, nobody's yet noticed that when I disappear off, it's because I need to give myself an insulin injection. Why should that be a secret? You know, why can't we say, you know, there are times when, and I just think it's about being very open and having a culture where preferably leaders within the organization can be open and demonstrate inclusion in their behaviors. So if they have a hidden difference, to be open about that, so that people feel, well, if they can, I can be open about this. But also to be very, have a culture that is supportive and nurturing and wants to get the best out of people. And everybody will thrive in a climate like that, not just disabled recruits, but, you know, anybody in an organization where clearly you're being nurtured, you feel as though you belong, you're valued, you're listened to. If you need something, that's taken seriously. For me, that just doesn't just make a great organization for disabled people to work in, it's a great organization for anyone to work in.
Right. Yeah, we should. I think the first action that needs to be taken in any organization is to stop making assumptions and just to ask people what they need.
Absolutely, absolutely.
Jane, thank you so much for this insightful conversation. Thank you
My pleasure.
for your input. It was lovely talking to you. Uh,
Thank you very much.
Thank you.